Thank you all for coming tonight and sharing your evening with me. I usually haven't come to these. I'm hoping to not necessarily stick to the slides. If there are burning questions that you have, feel free to raise your hand and interject. We run the risk of maybe not covering some of the material that I've planned to present to you, but I'd rather answer your questions and make sure that the material that I'm covering is of interest to you. I have done work in the area of cannabis use in neurocognition pretty much since I was in graduate school. But that encompasses a lot of different aspects of that very general realm. And today I'm only going to be talking to you about a slice of that. Bring this keyboard a little bit closer to me so I don't lose the mic. Okay. So, a disclaimer. The views that I will be presenting today are my own. They are not the views of the National Institutes of Health, which have so generously funded much of the research that I will be presenting to you today. And I have no other disclosures or conflicts to report. So you're here because you want to learn about cannabis. You've heard something about it, and maybe you're not sure what it is. I'm kidding, of course. It's a plant. People dry it, they smoke it in all sorts of different things. And I like to keep, this is a slide that I've used for a very long time, and I like to keep it because now it has historical significance. Because this is what it looks like now. It's no longer those things down there, it's things that connect to your cell phones and vaporized bags, and there's an entire market and industry right now that is thriving, that revolves around helping you consume your marijuana in different ways. And much of it is untested, unscientific, ungrounded, but a lot of marketing going on. So here you have all sorts of different vaporization devices. And not only have the methods for consuming changed, the cannabis itself has changed. It is certainly on average much more potent today than it was in the late 70s. The average THC content in a seized joint from the late 70s was about 4%. Now the average is about 8%, but the range of the THC content is much broader, and you can get much higher formulations. And if that's not enough THC for you, well, we've got you covered. We've got butters, and we've got waxes, and we've got shatter that can push the THC content up to about 80%. So you can get really blasted really fast. So we're still trying to figure out, most of what I'm going to tell you today is just about smoking the plant, the old school stuff. The studies right now are just starting to try to wrap their heads even about how we measure how much people are consuming of these other things, since we're not just kind of weighing plant and smoking joints. So it's a challenge in the field. Just wanted to point that out. I'm going to try to go a little quickly through some background. Some of you may know some of the things that I'll cover here. Some of you may not, but I think it's important foundational knowledge for some of the things that I'll be presenting on a little bit later in the talk. So I'll start with some prevalence, policies, and trends, some mechanisms of action, and then marijuana in the context of medical use. Then most of my talk is going to revolve a little bit more about the work that I've been doing. And there's lots of people doing fantastic work in this area. But since I'm the one who was invited to talk to you today, you're going to hear more about my work. Not because I think it's the most important work being done, but it's the one that I know the most about. That's going to focus on my work on cannabis and its effects on neuropsychological functioning. I'll talk a little bit about just some general findings, some neurocognitive risk factors for heavy cannabis use, as well as consequences on neurocognitive functioning from cannabis use. And they're going to shift gears to longitudinal investigations, since we're wrapping up one of our longitudinal investigations and data is starting to emerge from that. And then I'll talk a little bit about some future directions. So, lots of people have smoked weed. If you look at recent surveys of adults over the age of 12, 42% of individuals in the United States, based on these estimates, have tried marijuana at some point. As a reference point, look at some of the other prevalence rates for illicit drugs. So we hear a lot about the opiate epidemic, and not to belittle the significance of it, because the opiates will kill you and you will overdose, and that's not going to happen with cannabis. But you're looking at prevalence rates of non-prescription use of pain relievers at 6%, heroin at 2%. So cannabis is something that touches a lot of people's lives. It's also, and this is something that comes up a lot when I give presentations, even though it's not going to be a central focus of this talk. I'll just tell you, and we can talk about this a little bit later if you want more on this, but if we define addiction as compulsive use of a drug despite experiencing negative consequences, and that's the widely accepted kind of thumbnail sketch of what addiction is, cannabis is absolutely addictive. There is a percentage of individuals that smoke cannabis and use it so much and so often, despite it impacting their lives negatively, and their use of it is compulsive. It is the minority of most cannabis users, but that's the case with alcoholism and with cocaine use and even with heroin use. Most people that try heroin once don't necessarily become heroin addicts. So the estimates suggest that about 2 to 8% of people that ever try cannabis will go on to develop a cannabis addiction. Because so many people have tried it, you've got, as an absolute number, more people seeking treatment for cannabis addiction than you do for a lot of these other drugs that we consider to be much more harmful. So this is just to show you a little bit of the prevalence of use over time. This graph on the left has year on the bottom. I'm going to focus on that line in red, which are 12th graders. And this is monitoring the future data. And this is looking at the percentage of kids that have used cannabis in the last 12 months. If you look at that left portion of the graph, you can see historically that the peak in terms of number of 12th graders that smoked cannabis was actually in the late 70s. We are nowhere near that peak now. But you can see there was this big dip into the early 90s, then a rise, and then kind of like a little undulating curve that's going on. And the most recent data has suggested like about a 1% uptick. But don't know what that means for future use. If you look at this, you can see almost the inverse relationship when you look at the question of what percent of kids see great risk in using cannabis regularly. So the less risky that youth are perceiving cannabis to be, the more that has associated with their use. Now, which comes first is not clear, although some evidence suggests that the decrease in risk precedes the increases in use. So you're talking about, right now, close to 36% of kids in 12th grade reporting that they used cannabis in the last 12 months. If you look at daily use among 12th graders, that's hovering at about 5–6%. Again, the highest peak was in the late 70s. Despite more people using cannabis in the late 70s than now, Gallup has been asking folks, do you think the use of marijuana should be made legal or not, since 1969. And despite people using more then, back then you only had about 28 to 25% of folks saying, yeah, cannabis should be legal. But look at what's happened over recent years. And look at that exponential growth toward the right. Right now, about 64% of Americans, the vast majority, think that cannabis should be legalized. So we're living in a very different climate from what we were before in terms of people's general thoughts about the legal status of cannabis. I'll add this though, no place that has legalized cannabis or has made it available for medical use, the actual full plant, has made it legal for kids under the age of 21. So even if there's a state that has made cannabis legal, it's not legal for everybody still. And here you can see currently the topographical depiction of cannabis laws across the United States as of the last election cycle. And each election cycle has brought more states with medical cannabis and more states with legal recreational cannabis use with each successive cycle. And that trend is expected to continue. So we should know what it does to us. We should know what it does to our kids. We should know what it does to our society. I think it's an important area of investigation. The cannabis plant has over 380 different compounds in all sorts of different chemical classes. The ones that we tend to focus on the most is THC. Another one that you may have heard of that's gotten a lot of attention is cannabidiol. It might have some of the same medical therapeutic benefits in certain situations, but it doesn't get you high. And for people who are recreational cannabis smokers, the high is what you're looking for. But for a lot of people who are not cannabis smokers, that go to their doctor and request cannabis for some sort of symptom relief, and they haven't used cannabis before, they actually don't want to be stoned or high. They see that as a negative side effect. They see it as somnolence. They see it as mental fogginess. They don't like that. So it's a side effect for some folks. Now, why does it change the way you feel and the way that you think? Well, the reason is because THC binds to cannabinoid receptors that are located on the presynaptic terminal of neurons in your brain. So you actually have receptors that bind specifically to cannabinoids. Your brain, your body, makes its own endogenous cannabinoids. There's several of them. The two major ones are anandamide and 2,8-G. THC, when you smoke it, eat it, whatever you do, the THC then binds to this place where the endogenous cannabinoids typically bind and changes the way that neurons signal. We didn't know about that cannabinoid receptor until the 90s, so it is a relatively recent discovery. The distribution of cannabinoid receptors in the brain varies by region. If you look at the slice on the right, it's a mid-sagittal cut. You're looking at half the brain. The darker the area is, the higher the density of cannabinoid receptors in that particular brain region. You can see that there are a lot of cannabinoid receptors in the hippocampus and amygdala, which are very important for emotional processing and memory formation. In the striatum, which is important for all sorts of cognitive activities, including motor functions. You see it all throughout the cortex and a lot in cingulate cortex. So you're talking about a system that's widely distributed in the brain, which means that there's lots of opportunities for developing medicines that could target the system, but at the same time, it's a system that if you target one area, you may affect others. So for example, there was a drug, rimonabant, which was a cannabinoid receptor antagonist that was being developed for the types of things that make drug companies a lot of money, right? Like growing hair, virility, and in this case, it was for weight loss, right? Everybody wants the pill that's going to make you lose weight. So you block the cannabinoid receptor. Endogenous cannabinoids help regulate hunger and appetite. You block them, you're not that hungry anymore, you stop eating. Well, they had to cancel the trials because at some point, folks were losing about 5 pounds, but they were also more likely to want to commit suicide and were incredibly anxious, so it wasn't worth it. So people are trying to tweak these systems and figure out how best to use them. So I had originally, when I was putting this talk together for this particular audience, I had several individual studies about how effective cannabis is for different medical conditions. But I decided to just present to you one very busy slide that summarizes, in my opinion, the best state of our knowledge on what cannabis may or may not be good for at this moment. So don't freak out when you see all the letters on there. I'm going to walk through it with you. So the National Academy of Sciences commissioned a report last year. They got experts and scientists in the field. I had the pleasure of being a reviewer for this report to try to put together the totality of evidence around cannabis. You can get this for free online. If you print it out, it's a book that's this thick. It covers all sorts of different topics: cancer, cognitive functioning, psychosocial outcomes, policies, all sorts of things. This is just the summary of the section around therapeutic uses of cannabis. So I'm going to walk through this with you. They classified the evidence based on whether they thought there was substantial evidence for something, moderate evidence of an association without causation, limited evidence of ineffectiveness, or insufficient evidence. So you may have heard a lot about, cannabis is a potential panacea for all sorts of problems. Right now, the state of the literature suggests that substantial evidence for cannabis being effective as medicine only currently exists for chronic pain in adults and for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, as well as for patient-reported symptoms of spasticity in multiple sclerosis. I see some of you taking pictures of the slides. That's absolutely fine. I don't mind it at all, but I'm happy to also email you all of the slides. So
I just wanted to mention, this is being video recorded, and you all have access to the PowerPoint presentation and to the video as well.
So you're welcome to continue. It's not to discourage you, but it's to let you know that, don't worry, you can have access to all of this when I'm done as well. Moderate evidence for short-term sleep outcomes in patients with very specific sleep disturbances: sleep apnea, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, and MS. Limited evidence for increasing appetite and weight loss in HIV, for clinician-measured spasticity symptoms in patients with MS, symptoms of Tourette's, improving anxiety symptoms in individuals with social anxiety disorder, improving symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Very limited evidence for better outcomes after TBI, limited evidence for it being ineffective in dementia, in glaucoma. Remember, glaucoma was the one that was like the beginning, yeah, cannabis, not good for glaucoma, apparently. And depressive symptoms in individuals with chronic pain. And then there is no evidence right now that suggests that use of cannabis is effective for cancers, for cancer-associated loss of appetite, for irritable bowel syndrome, for epilepsy, which some of you may be surprised, because that's one that's getting a lot of attention, but no, the evidence is not there. And interestingly enough, people are trying to market on this. You know, there's no one that's easier to market to than a very desperate parent, especially if they're in a situation with a child that they're trying everything and nothing is working. And part of the problem with some of these medications, for example, CBD oil, is that now you may have individuals selling it over the counter, all over the place, and you don't know. I mean, this is not going through standard pharmaceutical integrity checks. You don't know the purity, you don't know the dosage. So it's wild, wild west when it comes to these things. Google knows I'm into cannabis. My email knows I'm into cannabis. You know, I get all of these ads in my mail all the time about all sorts of different cannabis products that they want me to check out or look at or whatnot. So the marketing is way ahead of the science. What else? Not useful for Huntington's disease based on the available evidence, not ALS, not spasticity symptoms in patients with paralysis, not Parkinson's disease, not dystonia. This was not surprising. Not abstinence in people who are addicted to drugs. There's actually some animal literature suggesting that co-administration of cannabis with, and not necessarily cannabis, for the animals they use something else because the animals don't self-administer cannabis, like do some other drugs, but it could end up actually making addiction of other drugs worse. There's some very early evidence, and just as an aside, that's not part of this report, and then mental health outcomes in individuals with schizophrenia. So the list over there is a lot longer than the list up there. And then the question then is, let's say that it is effective for some of these things with the evidence that's there. Is it more effective than current treatments? And that's the next question. If you find some evidence that it may be effective, then is this a better treatment? Is it more effective than other things that are currently out there? I saw this study recently, and I thought it answered then another question that comes up when people think about cannabis for therapeutic use. And it's like, okay, well, maybe it doesn't do a whole lot for some of these symptoms measured in objective studies. What does it do for quality of life? What does it do in terms of patients' well-being? So this meta-analysis was very recently conducted. They put together all of the studies that have examined the effect of cannabis use on well-being and quality of life in individuals that were taking it medicinally for a variety of disorders. Some of you may be used to looking at forest plots, some of you may not. What that's showing is the average effect for each study, and then down at the bottom, the average effect across studies. The important thing that you need to know is if that little bar around that diamond is crossing that line going down the middle, it means that there's no effect. So what they're finding overall is that there's no effect. Either comparing groups that get it and don't get it, or a group of individuals that doesn't have it, then they get it, and then they look at change. So this evidence is suggesting that it is not improving quality of life on average. Okay, so that is what I've got to tell you about therapeutic medical use of cannabis, and I've summarized the state of the literature in a very quick set of slides. Now, if something impacts your brain, if it changes the way you think and feel, if it can be potentially therapeutic and helpful, chances are it probably also has side effects. You help the system over here and you kind of mess it up over there, and it's a balancing act. So what are the side effects of cannabis? Well, during Prohibition era, the established side effects were murder, insanity, and death. That doesn't seem to be the case. And I think, people have caught on to that. When I was growing up, and I was in that junior high school, kind of late elementary school time, what they taught me was that if I smoked cannabis, my brain would turn into a delicious, beautiful fried egg. And it would just say, this is your brain on drugs. Any questions? Yeah, people had a lot of questions. They started using to try to find the answers, like right around that time. Okay, so what do we know about some of the potential side effects of cannabis? I'm going to focus on the neurocognitive effects, because that's what I study, but I want to give you a little bit of a synopsis of other things. I don't want you to come away with what I'm going to show you thinking that this is it for how cannabis can impact somebody's life. I'm going to focus on the neurocognitive. But here is a summary from a review looking at a variety of areas. So, confidence of an effect based on the literature. Addiction to marijuana, high. This is, sometimes I bring this up, people are like, oh, is marijuana addictive? Is it psychologically addictive? Is it physically addictive? Well, sometimes when people say physical addiction, what they're thinking about is a withdrawal syndrome that occurs when somebody's using the drug and they stop. There is evidence for cannabis withdrawal syndrome. It doesn't kill you, it just makes you super grouchy, makes you irritable, it messes with your sleep, it decreases your appetite, and the people around you are upset that you quit using pot and you can't just kind of be nice and chill. You're all upset because you stopped. So that's a withdrawal syndrome. And as I mentioned, there is a subset of individuals who try cannabis who go on to develop compulsive use despite experiencing negative consequences. There is some evidence for abnormal brain development, and by abnormal, that means different brain development in kids who are using versus those who are not using. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Some evidence for use of cannabis being associated with the progression of use to other drugs, some median evidence for increased risk of schizophrenia. This is a very controversial topic, and there are studies that find results in all sorts of different ways. My read of the literature, and I think well, obviously it's taken as my opinion, you can read the literature and come away with your own opinion, but the evidence suggests that if you're somebody who may have a vulnerability to psychosis and to developing schizophrenia, the pot is not going to help. It's probably going to make it worse, it might bring the symptoms on sooner, it might exacerbate them. But the evidence is not solid to say that smoking cannabis causes schizophrenia. That evidence is not strong. Depression and anxiety. Diminished life achievement, high. Use of pot during adolescence is associated with, and there's a lot of other shared risk factors that go with this, lower academic achievement, worse jobs down the road. Motor vehicle accidents, high, yeah. Driving high increases your risk of having an accident. Not as much as drinking alcohol, not as much as texting, and this has been studied, but it does. It increases it more than just driving home. High evidence of symptoms of chronic bronchitis from regular use of cannabis, and no evidence for lung cancer. That's been studied 6 ways to Sunday, and they have found nothing. Now I'm going to shift to some of the results from my own work and the work that is taking place in my lab. So one of the first papers that I had the pleasure of working on related to cannabis was a meta-analysis that was published about 15 years ago. This was the first meta-analysis conducted on cannabis. At this point, the literature was very shaky. There were a lot of studies looking at the effects of cannabis. And again, when I'm talking about this is not about how you're thinking when you're high. This is if you're a cannabis user and you're not high, what's your cognitive functioning like? There were a lot of very poorly controlled studies. We looked through the entire literature. There were thousands of articles on this, but only about 13 of these articles, 14, were thought to meet the basic requirements that one would expect in a study that wanted to conclude a relationship between cannabis use and cognitive function. So for example, they assess mental health, they assess neurological issues, they control for it, they measured other drug use, they controlled for that, and these were the results in 2003. Here we have different neurocognitive domains at the bottom: reaction time, perceptual motor, attention, executive functions, motor, verbal, learning, recall, and retrieval. These are the same sort of error bars that you saw in that other forest plot. They're just now horizontal. And what you see here is that we see an effect for learning new information and then your ability to recall that information, suggesting that cannabis users who were not acutely intoxicated and were tested on this neurocognitive battery had worse memory performance than non-users. And this is about a third of a standard deviation. A new meta-analysis was conducted in 2012 by another group. They looked at a completely independent set of studies, but at this time, there were many more high-quality studies available. And they found very similar results. They replicated the effects on learning and forgetting information. And first, I want you to focus on the little turquoise, cyan, light blue little bars. They also though, now that there was more evidence available, also found a significant effect for executive functions, attention, and motor abilities. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the green bar, because this is very interesting. And there were some individual studies that had looked at this, but never in a meta-analysis. There were now, at the time that this meta-analysis was published, 13 studies that not just assessed neurocognitive function immediately after an individual had stopped using cannabis, they then also went ahead and put those individuals in supervised abstinence and measured their neurocognitive performance over time. So now they're saying, all right, if you're a heavy cannabis user and you stop, what happens to your neurocognitive functioning a month out? And what you find is that they go back to normal. So none of the green bars show a difference. So it suggests that your brain does get back to normal if you stop use. And this is consistent with the animal literature. The animal literature shows that you put a lot of THC in a rat's brain, their brain starts down-regulating cannabinoid receptors, it starts getting rid of them, there's too much of this activation going on. Then when there's no THC in the system, your brain slowly takes some time to bring those cannabinoid receptors back up. Once they're back up, you're back to normal.
Could you say a word about the age of the subjects?
So the question is, can I say something about the age of the subject? So at that time, all were adults. So now I'm going to shift to adolescents and youth.
Before you shift, could you define for the rest of us what executive function is?
Absolutely. So executive functions are abilities that have to do with abstract problem solving, planning, inhibiting behaviors. They're all these sorts of things that are called higher order cognitive abilities. So they're a little bit more complex than, say, for example, just simple reaction times or memory or, say, motor skills, because for executive functions, all of that has to come together. It includes things like working memory, your ability to keep multiple bits of information in your mind at the same time, and abstraction and problem solving. And I'm going to talk specifically about one particular executive function, which is decision making, where a lot of my work has focused on in recent years. Now, a comment about the age. So there's a question, and I'm not going to get into this deeply, but there's a question, I'll get to, the last slide will address it, but there's a question about, does it matter when you're smoking your cannabis? Is it going to be more harmful if you start smoking after your brain's developed versus if you start smoking when your brain is still developing as an adolescent? And there were emerging cross-sectional studies suggesting that the younger you start using, the worse it is for you. Some of the other work that's coming out now says, maybe, maybe not. We're still trying to wrap our head around it. I'll tell you a little bit more about that toward the end. So let me tell you a little bit about this construct of decision making, since a lot of what I'm going to show you next has to do with this. So right now, you could go to the beach and enjoy spring break, sleep on the couch, or if you like a more quiet beach, you could go to one of our beautiful beaches. All of you had these options today. All of you had these options before you came to this room. What are you doing here? You're constantly making these trade-offs in your mind. So you have these things that are immediately pleasurable, rewarding, and satisfying in front of you all the time. But you decide, your brain does all the computations and says, you know what? This is going to give me the biggest reward now, but if I do that, it's going to give me a negative outcome in the future. So this construct of decision making has to do with you making trade-offs between risk and rewards to optimize the outcome for yourself. So you came here, perhaps, because you're thinking about licensure, if you're getting CE credits, and you kind of don't want it to sneak up on you, again, thinking of the future, or you want to learn something interesting. I mean, you don't know me. You don't know if I'm going to give a good talk. It could be a terrible talk. Or, I may not have a lot of useful information to give you. You may walk out of here knowing nothing at all. But you took that risk. You put away the immediate potential rewards that were available to you today to maybe not do the funnest thing available to you to hopefully get this longer term outcome. So, individual with damage to orbital frontal cortex, which is a part of the brain that kind of does this decision-making computation and integrates information about somatic states with future behavior, is very important for decision-making. And some of the earlier tasks that were developed to tap into decision-making were discovered with individuals who had damage to orbital frontal cortex. But it happens that individuals who are addicted to drugs of abuse also show deficits in decision making, and in neuroimaging show some deficits at times in orbital frontal cortex functioning, despite not having necessarily frank damage to the orbital frontal cortex. So this was a construct that was of interest to me and that I've been looking at in various studies. And let me put this now in the context of cannabis use. So here are brain systems having to do with memory. You've smoked pot before, you liked it, you have good memories about it, it's salient to you, you want to smoke it. You've got this herb like right in front of you, it looks beautiful, your brain's like, yeah, smoke it, smoke it, smoke it, smoke it. And then there's another part of the brain that involves this orbital frontal cortex that says, no, don't smoke it, you're in school, you're at work, you can't smoke this now, save it for later, or don't do it at all. There's this trade-off going on. If that orbital frontal system is weakened or dysfunctional, the outcome then is somewhat different. You smoke the joint. So we have laboratory tasks that are used to probe decision-making in the laboratory. So I don't have enough time to get into the details of all of these, but let me give you an example. So in the lower left, you've got the BART. In that task, you start pumping up this balloon. The balloon starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Every time the balloon grows a little bit, you get 5 cents. Money starts accumulating. You can cash out, get the money, and start on another balloon whenever you want. Or you can keep blowing that balloon up, see how big it gets. Try to get as much money as you can on any given trial. And individuals with substance use disorders try to make the balloon a lot bigger than individuals that don't. Some of the other tasks here, where I'm going to show you some data on the Iowa gambling task, the cups task, the game of dice task. I'll show you the game of dice task down in that lower right. There, individuals are told, hey, you're going to start out with this much money. What you have to do is just decide how you want to, what kind of choice do you want to make. You can pick one number to come out, and you can win a lot of money, but you can also lose a lot of money. Or you can pick one of the ones in the bottom where you win if any of 4 numbers come out. There you win less money, but if that number doesn't come out, you also lose less money. So the risks are obvious, the contingencies are clear. Individuals who have substance use disorders, have addictions, tend to go more with the high risk, potentially high reward. But if you go with that choice throughout that task, you're going to end up in debt. You're not going to end up with winnings. So these are tasks that we use to probe this in the laboratory. There are neuroimaging studies that use this task to look at different parts of the brain that are involved in these processes. So I'll start with one of the first studies that I conducted to try to look at decision-making in individuals who were cannabis users. These were young adults, ages 17 to 24. The exclusion criteria, which is one that we use for all of the studies that I'm going to show you to try to control for things that can affect performance that have nothing to do with cannabis use, are things like developmental disorders, severe psychiatric issues, neurological confounds, if they have significant alcohol use, including alcohol dependence, significant use of other drugs. For example, in this particular study, we had a group of cannabis users, about 65 of them, all identified cannabis as their drug of choice. They had used more than 200 times in their lifetime, had used in the last 45 days, and had a history of pretty regular use, about 4 times a week. And then we had a group of non-users who were matched on all sorts of relevant variables, things that they weren't matched on, were controlled for in analyses. These had used cannabis less than 10 times ever in their life, hadn't used any pod in the last 90 days, and had never used as frequently as the previous group. So in this study, we compared them on a variety of measures of decision-making, and then we also compared them on a variety of measures of memory, with the hypothesis being that we were going to find differences in memory, since that's one of the cognitive abilities that you can pretty much hang your hat on, that cannabis users, regular, heavy cannabis users are going to have problems with, and measures of decision-making. Because with the measures of decision-making, it's a little bit less clear. There's 2 hypotheses around the measures of decision-making. It could be that your use of cannabis is interfering with the development of the orbital frontal cortex during adolescence, and that is why individuals perform more poorly on decision-making tasks. The alternative hypothesis is that there are individuals who already, for whatever reason, have problems with decision-making, and when they come across a drug like cannabis, they're more vulnerable to escalating their use and developing cannabis-associated problems. So here we expected to find differences in both memory and decision-making. That's not what we found. We found the expected differences on tests of memory. That HVLT is a list learning task. And here we've just kind of standardized the performance to show you this on the same graph across all of the measures on the overall group means. The black bars are the non-users, higher is better for the memory tests, lower is worse. And what you're seeing is about half a standard deviation difference between the users and the non-users. So in other words, we're replicating the memory findings. We're finding that our young adult cannabis users are showing memory deficits. But on the right, you've got all these measures of decision-making and inhibitory control, and we found no differences there on those tasks. So we probe a little further, and now we look at relationships between each of those measures that I just showed you and how many symptoms of a cannabis use disorder the individual has. How problematic is their cannabis use? How compulsive? How many problems are they experiencing from it? And there we did find a relationship. We found a relationship between one of the measures of decision-making, the Iowa gambling task, and the number of symptoms. The better they did on the gambling task, the fewer symptoms of a cannabis use disorder that they reported, suggesting that this construct of decision-making may be more relevant to the problems that a cannabis user experiences from their use rather than a consequence of use. But that's an empirical question to test. With this same sample, we examined this question in a slightly different way. We looked at relationships between amount of cannabis use, and you can see that on the x-axis, lifetime amount of cannabis use, amount of use in the last 12 months, amount of use in the last 30 days, and this MPS total. The MPS is the marijuana problem scale. The higher it is, the more problems that the individual is reporting from their cannabis use. And what we find is that if you split this up into individuals that did really well on the Iowa gambling task, this decision-making task, those that did about average, and those that performed poorly on it, you find a relationship between amount of use and problems from cannabis use, those diagonal solid lines going out, only in the group that had impaired low decision-making. So that means that for folks that had good decision-making, the amount of marijuana that they smoked was not related to the problems that they experienced from cannabis. That doesn't necessarily mean they didn't have problems from cannabis, but it just wasn't tied to the amount. That relationship between the more you smoke, the more problems you have, was only when decision-making was impaired. So this led to another set of studies, which are the ones that we're starting to wrap up now and starting to publish some data on. So you guys are going to see some very recent data, most of it unpublished, a lot of it is under review right now, some of it is in preparation, and there'll be more coming as the year goes on. This is just a reminder to let you know, because what's going to happen now is that I'm going to shift to a younger age group. That previous work was all with adults and young adults, but if I want to really try to understand how decision-making relates to cannabis use and whether it's something that is there, the decision-making deficits are there before the cannabis use gets bad, or whether it happens as a consequence of cannabis use, I have to start with kids that are earlier in their stages of cannabis use. This is a very heavily used slide that just shows you how the brain continues to mature and change. These are measures of cortical thickness. And what happens is what you want to see is your brain become actually a little less thick as you start going through adolescence, because that shows specialization and pruning. And what you can see is that there's development going on up until your early 20s. And this orbital frontal cortex, so that would be the area kind of under the front part of that view, continues developing well into your early 20s. So there are cannabinoid receptors there. Perhaps if you smoke a lot of cannabis and the cannabis is binding to those receptors, that might impact your neural development. So the data that I'm going to present you now is from the Choices study, which we've been doing over the last 5 years here at FIU, and that's about to wrap up. I'm very happy to see that Karen is here. She is the lead, most effective research assistant that I've ever had working on this particular study. She's taken the lead on that for several years, so I'm glad you're here to see some of the fruits of your labor, as well as Diana, who's the lab manager for the study. She has her hands not just in Choices, but in a bunch of other projects as well. So let me tell you just a little bit about the overall Choices study and the study design, and kind of a little bit about the participants. So these are 401 youth recruited from the Miami-Dade area. They, when they were brought into the study, they were between the ages of 14 to 17. But there's really like only 1 or 2 17-year-olds. They're mainly 14 to 16 years old when they started with us. And they're assessed every 6 months for 5 assessments that take place each 6 months apart. There's a full assessment that not just assesses substance use, but also assesses their neurocognitive functioning, every other assessment wave. So we have 3 measurement waves where they are conducting, they're completing a lot of tests of decision making, memory performance, in addition to very detailed interviews about substance use, mental health, and a bunch of other things that we ask about that I'm not going to be talking about today. We exclude individuals with any neurological problems, learning disabilities, severe psychiatric disorders, no head injuries with loss of consciousness greater than 10 minutes, no history of significant use of alcohol or other drugs, although as the study goes on and they stay in the study list longer, they may start using other things. And when they come into the study, they have to be using cannabis more frequently than other drugs. This is a sample that's selected to be at risk for escalation in their cannabis use. About 10% of the sample were non-users. We did that for a couple of reasons. One, to have some non-users in the sample for comparisons, but also because when you're doing a study like this, you wouldn't want, you'd essentially be breaking confidentiality if everybody in the study is required to be a cannabis user. So we have cannabis users and non-users in the study. So first I'm going to show you just some cross-sectional data from baseline. We haven't analyzed all of the data across all the measurement waves yet. We have 1 participant left, Karen, or we have 1 participant left to wrap up all the data collection across all of these 5 measurement waves. So papers that are looking at the overall study, the original aims, we'll start working on those this summer. So this is just baseline data. For baseline, and this is not the way that the groups were selected, but this was a categorization that was done just to compare these 14 to 17-year-olds who are kind of starting in their cannabis use to see how they differed at the beginning of the study on different measures. We have a group of regular recent users. These are individuals that have used at least 1 time per week for 3 months and have reported use in the last 30 days. We have a group of non-regular recent users. So these never used 1 time a week for 3 months, but they also did use recently. They used in the last 30 days. And you might remember the reason why this recent use is important is because that's where you tend to see the impacts on memory. And when you go a month out, if they're not using anymore, those differences tend to go away. We have past users who've used more than 3 times ever, but not in the last 30 days. And then this group of minimal non-users that have used either less than 3 times in their life or not at all. Lots of numbers here. I'm not going to go through all of this. Some of you who are used to looking at these things are probably scanning through and looking at comparisons already for some of this. I just want to point out that if you look at that the group right now is about 15 years of age across all of the 4 groups. If you look at past year diagnoses of a variety of mental health disorders, you see that it's very low in the sample. And the only place where you see significant differences in the diagnosis of cognitive disorder between these groups. If you look at their nicotine use, it's relatively low, their median and interquartile range of use. If you look at their alcohol use, it's also relatively low. And if you look at the cannabis use parameters, that's where you see the difference that you'd expect. The regular recent group, the median amount of joints that they've smoked in their lifetime is about 170, but the interquartile range goes from 64 to 311. Past month frequency, median of 9 among the regular recent users, 3 to 17. Lifetime dependence, it's hard to get the lifetime dependence diagnosis for cannabis, not a lot of it there. And you can see a little bit more metrics, day at first use. And if you look at other drugs, that's just cumulative across all the 14 drug classes that we ask about, use of other drugs and lifetime just use history diagnosis. This is a group of predominantly cannabis users it's the group that we set out to recruit. So this is just to kind of let you know, this is a pretty, if you do this type of work, relatively clean group of kids who are starting and escalating in their cannabis use.
Are they in Miami?
Yes, this was all done here. We recruited from local schools, high schools. And word of mouth, and we tried movie theaters at one point, the works. So this is their decision-making data. Here what you're looking at are between group comparisons across these 4 groups. You've got the regular recent users in green, the non-regular recent in orange, past users in gray, and then the non-minimal users you can't see because the data is standardized to their performance. So they're at 0 with a standard deviation of 1. And if you can see across the board on these measures of decision-making, we're not really finding any differences on the CUPS task, which looks at decision-making in conditions where you could win money and under conditions where you can lose money. The game of dice task is the only one where we see significant differences. And the difference is between the cannabis using groups and the non using group. The cannabis using groups are not differing from each other. And then on the IGT, we did not find differences. It may look like there are differences when you're looking at those standard error bars, but it did not survive control for multiple statistical comparisons. So my take-home message from this is that you tend to see riskier choices among individuals who have used cannabis. And it doesn't seem, at least from here, to be related to whether they used recently or not, or how much they're using. So it may be more of you're risky, you're willing to try it, compared to the folks that haven't used at all. So we did not find any whopping effects here. But of course, we're also looking at memory performance. That's our anchor. That's where we expect to find differences. And we do find the pattern that one would expect. And again, these are now 14 to 16-year-olds in the early stages. This is not like the other studies with adults who have a much more extensive history of use. And here you can see that the cannabis users, those colored bars, and particularly the recent users, regardless of whether they're regular users or non-regular users, are showing the poorest performance across the memory measures. The only statistically significant differences that was observed, though, was on your ability to recall information that you previously learned. And the difference there was between the non-using group and the regular recent group. So I feel confident that we're detecting the memory signal in these kids already at a very early stage, but we're not seeing much with decision making. Now, of course, the study was not designed from the outset to do between group comparisons at baseline with particular groups. What the study was designed to do was to test the hypothesis of, number one, does baseline levels of decision making prior to escalation in cannabis use predict escalation in cannabis use? And then conversely, does changes in cannabis use affect decision making? That was the goal. So for that, we need the longitudinal data. Jackie Duperouzel, a graduate student in our wonderful clinical science program, and I see some of the folks here, shout outs to the clinical science students. She started looking at the relationship between baseline performance on these neurocognitive measures. I'm going to walk you through all these little arrows shooting each other. Baseline performance on these measures, and then what happens 1 year later. So this is not using our 2-year data, which we're going to start looking at soon. And here, there are a couple arrows that I want to bring your attention to. In the lower left, we have decision making. This is a latent construct of decision making. It considers performance across all of decision making tasks and puts it all together as like, this is that individual's decision making. So what we care about most here, what I care about most here, is the arrow from decision making at time 1 to that S. That S represents the slope or change in cannabis use from when they started the study to year 1. I'm also interested in the arrow that goes from the S to decision making at time 3. What that arrow essentially answers is the question of, does the change in cannabis use relate to the change in decision making? So those are the 2 questions that we set out to look at. So what does this show? Well, this shows that I, which is the levels of cannabis use when somebody started the study, is related to how much their cannabis use goes up. Okay? It also shows that the amount of cannabis that you're smoking is related to your decision making at baseline. So somewhat different from these between group comparisons that I showed you. It's a different way of looking at this. With more cannabis use, poorer decision making. And of course, not surprisingly, decision making at time 1 is related to decision making at time 3, which is the 1-year follow-up. So here, our hypotheses did not bear out. We're not finding a relationship between decision making at time 1 and how cannabis use changes over time, and we're not finding a relationship between change in cannabis use and decision making, change in decision making. Let's see what happens with memory. With memory, and I'll explain why that's blue and not red in a second. With memory, we do see a relationship between change in cannabis use and change in memory performance. As cannabis use goes up, memory performance goes down. This is immediate memory, ability to learn new information. People's memory at time 1 is not related to the change in cannabis use, and memory performance at, cannabis use at baseline is related to memory performance at baseline. But if you control for the handful of individuals that tested positive for very recent cannabis use, at time 1, that baseline relationship goes away. But the relationship between the slope and the change does not go away. So we're finding the memory effect. For delayed memory, we found something surprising, and this data is about like a week old, 2 weeks old, so we're still trying to get at this, but this could be very provocative. We're actually finding that their delayed memory performance at time 1 was related to their change in cannabis use, and that was not expected. I typically tend to expect the memory problems to come as a result of the cannabis use, and this is suggesting that that already from the get-go, the kids that are going up in their cannabis use may already have some memory problems. So this is something that we need to look at a little bit more deeply. And these are interesting, useful analyses to do at this stage in the data analysis of this project, but the original goals were really to look at the entire sample, look at what sorts of patterns emerge in the sample, and then look at relationships between those patterns and these various neurocognitive constructs. So this is just showing you what the pattern of use looks like in our sample right now. These are latent class growth models. This is work that's being done by Dr. Sam Hawes in our group. And this is just looking at the data up until the 1.5-year mark, not the 2-year mark, which we're seeing the last participant next week to wrap all of that up. And what he finds is that there are 3 patterns that emerge from the reported use of cannabis in the sample. There is a group that has low cannabis use and stays pretty low throughout. That's the majority of the kids in the sample, about 74%. There's a group that starts higher and stays high and goes up a bit, and that's about 12% of the sample. And then there's a group that starts really low and escalates up. And that's the group that I'm really most interested in. What is it that makes some individuals just rocket up in their use while other kids who try it stay low throughout and presumably do not experience problems. So we expect the solution to stay the same when we have that last data point. These are going to be the 3 groups where we're then going to look at, all right, how does decision making differ among these 3 groups? How does memory differ among these 3 groups? What Sam was interested in doing was in understanding what contributes in terms of mental health issues to being in one of those 3 groups. And what he found was that conduct problems was important in differentiating the chronic high from the low and the escalating from the low. It's that comparison between escalating and low that's of most interest to me. And conduct problems was the only one that emerged there. ADHD symptoms seem to separate the low and chronic, and depression seemed to separate the low and chronic. But that discrepancy between the escalating and the low is only for conduct problems. And Sam is diving into it a little bit more, looking at callous and emotional traits in the sample and seeing how that ties into their cannabis use and the cannabis use trajectories. Okay, so I'm about wrapping up. I very recently published an article that if you're interested in particular, like in youth, and what's the best evidence that we have out there for causal relationships between using cannabis and it affecting your neurocognitive functioning, what's the best evidence we've got out there. These are the only studies that exist right now that are longitudinal studies trying to link cannabis use with neurocognitive performance. So there are not a lot of them. And the ones below the red line are the most interesting ones, because those were able to assess individuals before they started using cannabis, so they had performance for them before, and performance for them after. So I'll just tell you the kind of take-home message here. So most studies find evidence of declines in neuropsychological functioning after cannabis use is initiated. The magnitude of these effects are there, they're real, they're modest. They're about 1/3 to 1/2 of a standard deviation. So if you're used to thinking about IQ points, that would be the equivalent of about 5 IQ points, 6 IQ points, 7, 8 IQ points, more or less. In these studies, sometimes they find effects, but when they control for potential confounds like the psychiatric issues, other drug use, the size of the effects either shrink or they go away. And then the most interesting evidence that's emerging are from the 2 studies that also looked at twins. So they had data on identical twins, and they had their performance before the twins started using cannabis, and then after twins that were discordant for their cannabis use later. So you've got one twin that didn't smoke pot, and you've got one twin that did smoke pot. So that's like your best control. They're genetically the same. Well, so to that the genetic difference, no need to complicate the topic. But for all intents and purposes, compared to the other stuff that we do, they're as close as they get. They were raised in the same household. Well, no differences between the twins. If you compare the twin that smokes pot to the twin that doesn't smoke pot, their neurocognitive functioning is the same. So these studies are new. This is the vanguard of trying to wrap our heads around this. This does not mean that cannabis is harmless. This does not mean that cannabis doesn't have a whole bunch of other issues associated with it. But there's a story emerging that there's probably shared risk factors that contribute both to an individual using cannabis, escalating in their cannabis use, and showing differences in neurocognitive performance. And it's a really big set of things that we need to unpack to try to understand. So summary and conclusions from what I've presented today. Cannabis use is prevalent, particularly among older teens and young adults, and it's known to alter brain function. Cannabis is helpful for the treatment of symptoms of some, but certainly not most medical conditions. Additional work is needed to understand for whom and under what conditions it works, and whether it works better than existing treatments. Cannabis is associated with poor neuropsychological performance, and these associations are most consistent for IQ, memory, and executive functions. Poor decision-making is associated with being a cannabis user, but our evidence does not necessarily suggest that it's a consequence of use. Studies that measure changes in cannabis use before and after initiation of use find declines in neuropsychological functions. However, emerging evidence that these relationships, at least in part, may be due to shared risk factors. So the new study that was talked about during the introduction is the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. We're very excited to be a part of this study. We're very proud for FIU to be a site in this study. This is a national study that is the largest long-term study of adolescent brain and cognitive development. It was a brainchild of NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, to really unpack this question of the chicken or the egg that we've been swimming around for so long about which comes first. But it's grown into a study that's much more than that. There are many more institutes that have contributed to it. So now it's really become a large study about adolescent brain health. We are about to start we'll stop recruiting baseline participants in about September. We'll start our 2-year follow-ups of these participants in November. Overall, across all of the sites involved in this study, there's going to be at the end 10,000 healthy children who are going to be followed for 10 years. From pre-adolescence, they start at 9 to 10 years old. We'll see them going through puberty. We'll see them going through adolescence until they're hit about age 20. We're collecting data on anything and everything: genetics, screen time, sports involvement, culture, environment, acculturation, immigration status, neurocognitive functioning, a 2-hour brain imaging protocol, a DTI, a resting state, connectivity, functional neuroimaging, toxicology. I'm missing a whole bunch of stuff. And it's not just from the kid, it's also from the parent, family conflict, all of these things that all of these disparate literatures have looked at kind of independently of each other. We're trying to bring it all together to look at it in a very cohesive way. And the most wonderful thing about this is that it's an open science model. We're doing all this work so that anybody who wants to analyze this data can go at it. The first data release happened about a month or so ago. Through your institution, if you're a researcher, you can request access to this data. That's all located in the National Data Archives. So we're doing data analysis, but everybody can check our work. Everybody can look at it as well. It's a very exciting project. So we'll be looking at individual developmental trajectories. What does the normal developing brain look like? How does cognition, emotion, and academic performance change and is related to all of these things? We'll be able to develop national standards for brain development. We'll look at genetics versus environmental factors. There's a bunch of sites that are doing twin studies embedded within this study as well, so there'll be twin data also. We'll look at things like physical activity, sleep, sports injuries. The media really has liked the screen time. We just have a handful of questions about screen time, but that really seems to capture people's imaginations because they see everybody staring at their phones, although this is a really great group. I mean, there's very little device distraction going on here today.
This is a very great speaker.
Very top thing. And then we'll look at how substance use affects the outcomes and vice versa as well, because we'll have all this data from baseline. None of the kids are using drugs right now. They're too young. Some of them have sipped here, sipped there. There was one kid who used bath salts. But we're talking right now, the sample, these are all sites. That's us in the lower right-hand corner. And this is a subset of the group of our wonderful team. And then all these lines that you're seeing here is the accrual of subjects across each of the sites since we started recruiting in October of 2016. And right now, as of last month, we have 8,192 participants. We're on track to get the 10,000 participants by September, which is, it's been a lot of work across all the sites. Fantastic effort. So that's all I have to show you today. Hopefully you have some time for a few questions. I want to acknowledge all of the folks. This is not everybody in the lab, but these are certainly the folks that were critical to the data that I presented to you today. And then hopefully at some other time I'll get to start showing you some of that ABCD data as well as some of the complete data from the Choices project. So if you folks have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.